Here we are, man. Last time we were on was when? I think it wasn't July. It must have been June
Hmm.
before we went into July. And at that point, the Jupiter Uranus conjunction had had about 3 months of its effects. And we
Hmm.
saw the market essentially kind of chop sideways from there. And this was right after the big eclipse in April, which was a total eclipse. And we'll talk about the solar, coming up, but that one in particular was powerful. And we see because eclipses will have kind of a instant kind of an effect within the first week or two, which kind of shows you what's up, what's happening. We had the helicopter incident with Iran, right? We had all kinds of stuff going on the technological front, which Uranus is correlated to technological revolutions and changes to where cybersecurity got a lot more, let's say, weak, and there were issues on that front. Crypto moving sideways was interesting because I think your research had shown that in the past, the Jupiter Uranus conjunction was not necessarily as bullish when it occurred. And for where we were, from a technical perspective, you and I had both saw this and called that out. The RSI was way too hot.
Hmm.
So what we've been observing is essentially a chopping sideways range bound between let's say this new all-time high, which was put in, and this kind of low area of that low that was put in around, let's say, 56K, which is a very important pivot point. We've kind of just been bouncing along there. One of the things that I think got us connected was a video that I had made that April where I was talking about what happens when Bitcoin puts in a new all-time high. Is that it usually looks like a definitive move that we cross above that all-time high and we spend some time above there. And since there's no sell pressure or sellers above that point, that's when we start to see that parabolic move. So Bitcoin's behavior was pretty interesting in April. As we said, the RSI being pretty hot. We saw it make a new all-time high, but it wasn't really a definitive strong one like we've seen in years prior. So we went up about what 2K higher than the previous all-time high. We've been chopping sideways. So we've still yet to really close and spend time above that new all-time high area
Hmm.
for that parabola to go. And
Right.
this is why a lot of people have been experiencing this as a very weird bull market. It's still a bull run, but it's just not as liquid as we're used to. This isn't 2021. There aren't stimmy checks rolling around. We're not all sitting at home getting into crypto. People are getting back into work. Their savings have been drained. And even the United States government themselves are cutting rates because they have debts to pay every 4 years, which
Hmm.
speaks to where we are in the cycle is liquidity, and I've been talking about this all year, is to the point where it needs to get back into the system because the United States is not going to default on their debts and just
Hmm.
stop being number one. Like that's ridiculous.
Yeah.
So more money is going to come in. To get really technical about it, Janet Yellen, who runs the Treasury, we all pay attention to Jerome. That's kind of a psyop. She's the one to pay attention to. She has the ability to issue hundreds of millions or billions, I think, of T bills left.
Hmm.
Millions, actually, hundreds of millions that she can still issue. That only creates liquidity that will essentially push assets higher. She might do that going into the election to support things, especially if we see a market drop, which is likely. I'll talk about that once we get into the eclipse talk. But
Hmm.
essentially, I just wanted to wrap up by saying it's been difficult because people haven't had the money. And we ran into this all-time high territory very hot without really cooling off. And so what we've experienced since April is that cooling off period. And so it could look like we have one more dip lower before we continue higher, or we just continue higher. October is going to be very volatile though, because we are in eclipse season, and I'll get into
Yeah.
that as we get into that. But just kind of summarizing where we've been and kind of my thoughts on the market and how I've been feeling it is
Hmm.
as long as we've been bouncing around that range between 55K and not really putting in a new all-time high, it's just been a cool off from the heat that we built up getting into March and April.
Exactly. And the first time we got together was perfect timing because it was right after that great American eclipse. And I remember us talking a lot about how Not necessarily in that chat, maybe a little behind the scenes, but we might have just trickled that into the initial time we got together on that podcast and the second round, which I do believe was in June. And we talked about how it was really that October eclipse, at least in my analysis, that we wanted to pay attention to. And the April 8th Great American Eclipse was all eyes on, right? Like everyone knew about it. It was
Yeah.
on the press, the mainstream media. We all were aware.
Even the National Guard was talking about it, right? Like
Exactly.
wear sunglasses or something. People were like, "What the hell's going on?"
Yeah, there was preparation done at many, many police stations, precincts, etc. So yeah, this was look here, don't look there sort of situation. And I think, of course, because maybe not entirely within your work, but for mine specifically, a lot of focus is on the markets, right? So there's all this focus specifically on the crypto market, and people always tie in these major geopolitical events and what the Fed is doing, like you said before, which I think is very spot on. The uh, Fed psyop, it's more about Yellen, and all the time we're getting these different elements and these different detour traffic cones that are making people go, "What should I do with my money now? Or am I too late? Or should I get in?" And there's a lot of uncertainty. And now having this 6 month period of sideways. Really looking back to those first two podcasts that we did, I think it's going to be incredibly valuable for people because there was the talk about leading up to this particular eclipse season, and what I was calling the fourth solar eclipse of our solar cycle for Bitcoin. And I want to be very clear on that because perhaps in your work, if you do talk about solar cycles, you might be talking about it on a much larger scale. People talk about like an 11-year solar cycle, or really with my work, I'm dialing it into the birth of Bitcoin from the Genesis block and then looking at it based on that and how it lands on its eclipses with Gregorian years, because that's kind of like what we're all spellcasted under. Of course, I could get much more complicated and bring in the Hebrew calendar and this, that, and the third, which I tend to do. But just to keep it super simple, I've discovered the relationship that Bitcoin has with eclipses and certain types of eclipses during certain phases of the what I'm calling the solar or lunar cycles. So I could bring up a visual real quick if you'd like, just
Absolutely.
to kind of allow that. Great. So you should see a chart. Let me know.
Yep.
All right. So I'm just going to zoom out. I actually custom made this chart. It's something that is included in my crypto decoding blueprint, and I show all of these red boxes and green boxes in relationship to what you see below is our lunar cycles or our solar cycles. So whenever you see a red box, that's a lunar cycle. Whenever you see a green box, that's a solar cycle. So I'm just going to quickly zoom in on the last cycle, which I feel is very interesting because, or sorry, the first bull run cycle, I should have said. It's very interesting because this was the year of the dragon into the year of the snake, and that's what we're in right now in Chinese Zodiac. And that's another part of my system that I like to loop into all of this because I did find patterns, especially for the stock market, but I'll get to that later. Just starting here, you can see that it's after our fourth solar eclipse, or what we could simply call the last solar eclipse of a solar cycle, is when the market peaks. And then we start to see it go into a downtrend after the start of a lunar cycle, which would have been this total lunar eclipse on mid-April 2014. So if I go over and I show you where the last solar eclipse of 2017, this is where we have our run up into the all-time highs before a total lunar eclipse in January, which follows by a downtrend or our bear market. Then we can see over here, even in the last cycle, we have December 2020. This was a total solar eclipse, the last solar eclipse of a solar cycle. We peaked out. Arguably, we did make a slightly new all-time high, but technically it was just a double top. And a majority of the crypto market, including all of the meme coins and the shit coins, were already on their way down. And Bitcoin already experienced the 56% or so correction during this phase. And that's enough to create an 80% mid-cycle correction for most altcoins. So we can technically call that the end of the bull run. And it was triggered by this lunar eclipse in May of 2021. And funny enough, every following lunar eclipse, we started to see major issues or black swan events isolated to cryptocurrency, such as this one here in May, which was the event with Terra Luna. Funny enough, Terra Luna collapses on a lunar
Mm.
eclipse.
Yeah.
And then we have the following eclipse, which literally was the Bitcoin bottom,
Yeah.
total lunar eclipse, and as well coupled with that SBF, FTX, FTT ritual.
Mhm.
Then what we see, and this is when I started teaching this publicly on the channel, I was warning people all throughout this phase over here leading into this eclipse that we want to watch out for the start of a new solar cycle because Bitcoin has this relationship with the final lunar eclipse leading into the new solar cycle where it recovers. So you see right here, this is a clear trend reversal breakout over here. This was last eclipse, lunar, into the first solar. Perfect recovery. Not the cleanest in the world because we had this black swan with the C19, but you still get what I mean. If you bought this last lunar eclipse of the lunar cycle, you made out like a bandit. We see the same thing in this iteration as well.
Mhm.
Same relationship. So, I mean, right now we're kind of waiting because as I just showed you with all those examples, Waters, will you be right this time where we have a new bull run start after the final solar eclipse of our solar cycle, which would be October 2nd, literally just a week away or so? So please know, everyone, that this is not a prediction. This isn't me telling you what the market will do. I just showed you with proof and evidence a chart that I've taken the time to map out eclipse by eclipse, cycle by cycle, and give you more of the answer to why Bitcoin has its bull runs in these quote unquote 4-year cycles. It has a lot more to do with this than it does with the halving. And I believe we share the a similar outlook that the halving is more just the exoteric thing that a lot of people have latched onto with a belief system that doesn't actually prove much in regards to the movement into price discovery or anything really. It's just out there information, and eventually it's likely to show some inconsistencies. One of which we just experienced recently, which was literally a new all-time high before the halving the
Mhm.
first time we ever got that. But one thing that still stands is we've yet to enter price discovery, which is something you brought up when
Yeah.
you were in the intro. We have yet to expand further. And what I've just showed you is that all of our expansion phases into that parabolic advance are in relationship to the final solar eclipse of a solar cycle. And the last thing I'll say is that that start of a lunar cycle is no joke. Even in this last iteration where we did go up for the double top, this was a lights out moment. And you would have had to start getting real fancy to buy the dip and then sell at a barely, to sell in this moment. It would have been very tricky. You'd have been hit with massive capital gains implications. So it's not recommended, right? Unless you're a professional trader. So yeah, this is kind of where we were in discussion at the first two podcasts,
Mhm.
and it was all leading up to this moment. So I think the timing of our podcast was amazing, and it's great that we were able to reconnect before this one, this new eclipse coming up.
Absolutely. And this is powerful, especially visually, for so many reasons, especially me just saying, we could be in the territory of October as it gets more volatile, where we see one more dip before continuing higher or just a continuation higher. And that's lining up with the timing of this fourth solar eclipse. And what's particularly interesting about this chart, if you could just zoom out just a little bit, yeah, and then move, yep, where we see here on the bottom, Friday 14th, March 25th is the start of the lunar cycle. And as you said, those aren't anything to play with. What's interesting about the end of March as we get into April is that we're going to start seeing some of the larger planets, which are correlated with generational movements, start to change signs, particularly moving from Pisces to Aries. What's important about Aries is that it's the beginning sign of its energy. Aries is the first phase of fire energy, and that's moving from a watery energy of Pisces to fire. Those elements do not mix. Going from water to fire is a volatile change. And then that's lined up with the start of a lunar cycle here. And so when we go into what are called cardinal signs, the first signs of a particular elemental energy, particularly with slow moving planets, the big ones like Saturn, Jupiter, Pluto, Neptune, Uranus, that is when we see big shifts in what we're experiencing societally. Now, to have three planets, which we're going to have Neptune, we're going to have Saturn and Uranus starting from April next year, changing signs. that means we're going into a whole new era of life and how we experience the world. And not only that, that means whatever direction the markets are going in are likely going to change that direction. So this isn't a blatant prediction either, but following what you just showed up here, we could see that parabola start to fizzle out or put its top in around March or so. And then we might see a change in direction of how markets are moving, going into a new regime or a new way of looking at the world or a new way of looking at things starting April of next year as well. So I
Hmm.
thought that was very interesting visually because there are a lot of planetary movements lining up supporting what just that chart showed with the lunar cycles and the
Yeah.
solar cycles as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And there is a lot of decoding that I've done for the year of the snake, which we're moving into at the end of January, new moon of 2025. So we're right around the corner from that as well. And March and April have a pattern for sure. So I would love to know, maybe if not now, a little bit later in today's podcast, some of your thoughts on the on that specifically. If there's anything else that you could show us visually, that'd be great, especially for my audience. But the March April timeframe is always an important time frame for the elite because that's more in alignment with the true new year.
Mm,
So we have this Gregorian New Year of January 1st. That's complete nonsense. It's make believe.
right.
And we just go along with it, of course, because it is what it is. But at the end of the day, when you start looking a little deeper into things, it starts to make sense why we have these big major events in March, April, or September, October. That's it. You'll see almost all of the coordinated financial events typically in those 4 months I just named, but it's really about the signs, right? That's where you'd go a little bit deeper. It's more around the vernal equinox and this recent autumnal equinox we just had. That's really it. That's really the powerhouse. And they obviously have that relationship facing each other. So yeah, we are in that moment right now. And I have put out a lot of information leading up to this where I was telling people, don't get worried about the geopolitical, or obviously, unless you're in a place that is impacted, please don't get me wrong here. But in
Right.
general, if you're not in a war zone, this is not something to get distracted by right now. If you are somebody who's interested in investing in finance, I was very clear. Don't get bearish because of your awareness about what could be going on with the war, what could be going on with politics, or what could be going on with any of that because the market is going to move up regardless of all that political and war, war narratives. It's just the energy of the markets. We have a time where war could affect the markets, and we have a time where it just doesn't. And we all know that at the end of the day, war is designed to make money. It's designed to make some people a lot of money, while a lot of other people go through a blood ritual sacrifice, sadly, but that's just the clear pill. So we're here. We're at this moment where, I mean, I made my last podcast and I was even emotional while I was making it because I talked about the next domino to fall would be Lebanon at least 5 months before it happened. And watching it start to happen and know people who are affected by it, it's fucking heartbreaking. And
Yeah.
to know that this is not a game, like we're pretty much officially in World War III.
Yeah.
And it's only, in my opinion, gonna get more and more volatile for the world stage. And this is how they prepare us for all the things that we've been talking about since C19, such as digital IDs and
Yeah.
UBI and
Yeah.
this, that, and the third. That they need chaos to bring in order. That's just the way they go. And they need to distract you in the final moments of the wealth transfer so that you are not a part of it.
Okay. What is of concern to me is that what we've seen with the eclipses in Aries and Libra is the continuation of drama in the Middle East, particularly concerning Israel and Palestine and that whole situation. Israel is a Libra rising nation. And the area of the eclipses that actually talk about reduction or letting go is in the sign of Libra, while the part of the eclipse where the moon is actually increasing its trajectory, which in Vedic astrology is considered to be the mouth of the dragon, where karmically people are ravenous, they're hungry, they're insatiably motivated to seek out that area and to build and experience increase in the material world on that side. That's on the opposite side of Libra with the zodiac sign of Aries, which is related to the battlefield and going after things. And so we've seen Israel's enemies actually attacking Israel or speaking up or putting their issues more into the limelight. And I wouldn't be surprised if we see more of a continuation of that story with the last series of eclipses here in that area. As you said, knowing people in those areas, it can be difficult to experience and see because these things are very real, right? And so I wouldn't be surprised if we see some kind of temporary resolution or amplification of that story during that axis with these eclipses or with this last eclipse here this October in the sign of in that axis of Libra and Aries. So that's something to just be careful about.
Hmm.
With the eclipses in Libra, they've really been prompting change and a lot of discomfort in relationships, particularly on a personal level. That's what it's been like for most of us, not on the grand stage of, governments and, Trump this or Netanyahu that. It's really been challenging relational dynamics for all of us. And we see that then with the allies or partnerships that these countries have. And on a larger front, you've probably talked about this. I know I have with people over the past couple of years of just warning them. This globalized experience that we have of the world where you can get an Amazon package here and you can talk to this person there, that's going to continue to change as nations become more concerned about their own needs rather than it being this globalized happy family, let's just follow the United States. It's going to be more about, well, how do we take care of our own and our own resources and make sure our own governments don't blow up internally? It's very much like the Game of Thrones out there in terms of keeping their kingdoms alive
Wow.
right now, right? So,
Wow. Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
yeah, man. So, with what's going on with the reduction of the Libra axis means that politics is actually very represented by Libra, the sign of the two scales of let's talk this out rather than shoot it out, right? And so, we've seen over the past 17 months or so as these eclipses have occurring, a weakening of that, a weakening of diplomacy, more of the violence and even the social unrest increasing. So, part of what that has done for us too, where we've had the Pluto and Libra generation and the Neptune and Libra generations, they've had to learn to form new visions and understand the importance of real life relationships and partnerships. Where the Pluto and Libra people have had to transform their relationships through really looking at how their relationships have failed or how they've been transformed or demolished in many ways. And this eclipse is going to trigger a lot of that. Where have we healed through
Mm.
the discomfort through the people that we know? And through the relationships in our lives that aren't going so well. We'll see that on a global scale with Israel and Palestine and with the United States, and we'll also experience that personally as well. And so it's really about getting in alignment with how you want to relate to people, and eclipses in particular can trigger that. And so that can look like issues with other people. And the
Hmm.
eclipses really talk about our relationships with other people, particularly, right? And so the fact that they're happening in the Libra Aries axis only exacerbates that in particular,
Mm.
because in our own individual charts where we see the North Node and the South Node taking place, they talk about karmic experiences in relation of how we relate to people anyway. And so what's interesting about this solar eclipse too is that this one's going to be 7 minutes long. The time of an eclipse tells us about the imprint it's going to have and how potent it's going to be, as well as how long of an influence it's going to have. It's a long one. 7 minutes is pretty long. I think the last one was about 4.5 minutes. They're not typically this long. Okay. And so the themes of upgrading and ending and shifting relationships is probably going to be very deep over the next 6 to 18 months because that's the span of effects or time that eclipses can have. So the intentions we want to set with the relationships we do have, very important, right? Very important. And we're probably going to see that on a global level too, where the United States has a lot of energy in which the relationships and partnerships it's having are under duress. It's under issue. And the enemies and the partnerships that the United States have actually have more power and more of an effect than they've actually had typically, at least for the past 12 years. And so we see things like the BOJ carry trade having a significant effect. We see things like what Israel's up to having a significant effect. And I think we'll continue to see people ramping up and getting stronger that are considered to be enemies of the United States while Jupiter is in the sign of Gemini between now and June. So that's another thing to look out for. And the eclipse itself, it's happening in the 11th place of the United States chart. What does that represent? Groups, social networks, long term income from the main career of the United States. So, which we could interpret that to be the global reserve currency, being the financial capital of the world and the global police. That's essentially the United States job, the world, right? So, an eclipse taking place there means something is getting eclipsed there. Something's going to shift there, which again speaks to the volatility that we're going to experience in the charts likely this October. You guys already know it's election season as well. That's only going to add to the volatility. What I have concerns about is this Mars Uranus alignment because Mars is in the cardinal sign of Cancer. And as I said, when planets move into cardinal signs where it's the beginning phase of an energy, we can see a lot of volatility or even shifts in market directions. Okay, so now that Mars is in Cancer and it's going to line up in putting an aspect with Neptune, we can see positive changes in how the United States actually handles its shared finances for a temporary period of time, which again could speak to some bullishness in the market. To me, it looks like the US is going to have opportunities to pay off some debts, which is what the rate cuts were for, and clearing
Hmm.
up some debts, which they need to do right now. And that also impacts the liquidity cycle, which for the short term, at least even what you showed, for the next 6 months could speak to some bullishness in the market in which the added money that's printed or made through treasury bills or added into the system by money being cheaper pays off debts and circulates its way into assets, making prices go higher. That's how
Hmm.
the system really works, guys. It's really that simple. Is when the government needs to pay for things, they will find ways to create money and it will chase asset prices.